KBA.com.
First thing I want to do, this is the last time I get to be with you at this meeting. Thank you so much for having me again. I enjoy this meeting so much because I come away a smarter person from all the great speakers we have the chance to talk to, and I hope you have the same result. It's a great meeting. If anybody back at your bank thinks, oh, they're going on a boondoggle to Marco Island, no, not really. It's a great educational session. And thank you all for having me. Thank the KBA for putting this on and getting all these great speakers here for us. Final speaker, I'd like to invite Bill Zombardi from Profit Resources to the stage to introduce our last speaker of the day, one I'm really looking forward to. My oldest son's in the Intel field, so I have a particular interest in this. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you. Good pronunciation on my name.
Good, good.
Hi, I am Bill Zombardi, and I'm with Profit Resources. PRI is a process and profit improvement firm, and we're honored to be an endorsed business partner of the KBA. We help KBA members with bank-wide efficiency improvements, core and digital system evaluation and contract negotiation, debit card profitability, and much more. And I am very pleased to introduce our closing keynote speaker, Professor James Olson. Professor Olson received his law degree from the University of Iowa. He's a professor of the practice at the Bush School, where he teaches courses on intelligence and counterintelligence. He served for over 30 years in the Directorate of Operations of the Central Intelligence Agency, mostly overseas in clandestine operations. In addition to several foreign assignments, he was Chief of Counterintelligence at CIA headquarters, which is in Langley, Virginia. And Professor Olson has been awarded many awards and acknowledgments, including the Intelligence Medal of Merit, the Distinguished Career Intelligence Medal, the Donovan Award, and several distinguished service citations. He is the recipient of awards from the Bush School and the Association of Former Students for Excellence in Teaching. Professor Olson is also the author of a couple of books, Fair Play, The Moral Dilemmas of Spying, and To Catch a Spy, The Art of Counterintelligence. Prior to his career in the CIA, he served in the U.S. Navy, where he attained the rank of Lieutenant Commander. I've heard Professor Olson speak on a couple of occasions, and I know you're going to enjoy listening to him today. So let's all welcome Professor Olson to the stage.
Could I have the first slide, please? Well, thank you very much, Bill, for that kind introduction, and thank you, Nainagatas, for inviting me to be back with all of you here today. It's a real pleasure to be in this beautiful location, to have the opportunity to share with you my views on a very timely and important topic. I feel very much at home with all of you. As some of you may remember, my first cover in the CIA was as an international banker. And so I was one of you, and I love bankers. I'll be happy at the end to answer any questions you have about my experience in the CIA, about Russia, about current events, or anything else that's on your minds. But first of all, I'd like to introduce a very special person. I'd like to introduce my partner in spying and in life, my wonderful wife, Meredith. Would you stand, please? Thank you very much. The subject of our discussion today is a monster. He's a tyrant. He's a megalomaniac. He has absolutely no respect for human life, international law, or national sovereignty. I first began tracking Vladimir Putin when he was still a lieutenant colonel in the KGB back in the 1980s in East Germany. And we in the CIA already knew back then what he was. We knew he was a killer. We knew how ruthless he was. Vladimir Putin in East Germany was providing KGB weapons and other support to the violent terrorist group Red Army faction that was responsible for many bombings and many killings in Germany and elsewhere. Speaking of Meredith, I met Meredith at the CIA, and we served together undercover for 31 years, doing espionage and covert action for our country. During all those years, our parents did not know we were in the CIA. Our children did not know. By the way, I should point out that for me, the CIA was the perfect place to meet my future spouse. Because when I met Meredith at the CIA, I knew she'd had a thorough background investigation and got regular polygraph exams. For much of my career, I was in counterintelligence. That meant that I was a spy catcher. And make no mistake about it, ladies and gentlemen, there are spies everywhere. There are probably spies in this room right now. So if you are a Russian or Chinese spy, could you stand up, please? I thought that was worth a try. From very early in his career, Vladimir Putin had blood on his hands. And he's even deadlier now than he was back then. We'll look at some of Putin's worst crimes, his assassinations, his bombings in Chechnya and Syria, his multiple human rights violations. And they will give us an idea of how truly evil this man is. But nothing he has done, ladies and gentlemen, can prepare us for what he's doing in Ukraine today. There are no words to describe the barbarity of Putin's atrocities against the Ukrainian people. He's worse than Milosevic. He's worse than Pol Pot. Vladimir Putin is a modern-day Joseph Stalin. Vladimir Putin was born on October 7th, 1952 in Leningrad. His father served in the Soviet Navy. His mother was a factory worker. Putin attended grade school and high school in Leningrad, and then received his law degree from the University of Leningrad in 1975. After graduation from law school, Putin joined the KGB. And Putin's early work for the KGB is not well known, but I have reason to believe that he did serve under deep cover in New Zealand, posing as a shoe salesman. Putin did surface for the first time in 1985 when he was assigned to Dresden, East Germany, to be liaison with the East German Stasi. And this is his Stasi ID card. In addition to supporting those terrorist attacks against the West, we know that Putin began dabbling in poisons, which would become a staple of his later career. Putin returned to Leningrad in 1989. He continued to work for the KGB there. But he resigned from the KGB in 1991 and began his political career, first in Leningrad and then in Moscow. And in the CIA, we saw this as a very ominous development. For a known KGB killer to be going into politics was bad news. And in 1997, Russian President Boris Yeltsin appointed Putin to be his deputy chief of staff. And then a year later, in 1998, Putin became the director of the FSB, the Federal Intelligence Service, the successor of the KGB. And with Yeltsin's help, Putin's rise to power was very rapid. He became the deputy prime minister in 1999. And Yeltsin stated publicly at the time that he wanted Putin to be his successor as president of Russia. And when Yeltsin unexpectedly resigned in December of 1999, Putin became acting president, and then he was elected president in his own right in 2000. And Putin has never given up power since. Even when Dmitry Medvedev was the nominal president of Russia from 2008 to 2012, Putin was still calling the shots. So Vladimir Putin has been the absolute dictator of Russia for the past 22 years. Putin's first real test as president of Russia came in October of 2002, when some 40 Chechen rebels seized a Moscow theater and took everyone inside hostage. And rather than letting the negotiations run their course, Putin ordered that a deadly chemical be pumped into the theater's ventilation system. All 40 of the rebels were killed, but also killed were some 130 innocent Russian hostages. And this was seen in the West by all of us as further sign of Putin's murderous instincts. And he's not changed. Here's a sad photo of the people of Russia mourning their dead, many of them children. Chechnya has been a thorn in Putin's side forever. He hates the Chechens. And what did the Chechens do to incur his wrath? Very simply, they had the audacity to resist his invasion of Chechnya and to fight for their independence. That's familiar, isn't it? It's exactly what we're seeing in Ukraine today. And in fact, Putin's war in Chechnya from 2000 to 2009 can be seen clearly as a blueprint and a dress rehearsal for what he's doing in Ukraine. Let me just tick off some of the things that Putin did in Chechnya. He was responsible for the indiscriminate bombing of civilian targets. He created up to 300,000 Chechen rebels. 80,000 Chechens were killed, over half of whom were civilians. He ordered the destruction of the Chechen capital, Grozny, as you see here. Hundreds of Chechens were executed without trial. 57 mass grave locations have been identified in Chechnya. Putin approved attacks on fleeing refugees and on medical buildings. And his troops, on his orders, went on a rampage of kidnappings, murders, hostage-taking, looting, and rape. And we're seeing exactly these same things, these same atrocities in Ukraine today. In the just recaptured Ukrainian city of Izium, as you've read, Ukrainian troops discovered mass graves there. And many of the dead showed unmistakable signs of torture. Putin's truly disordered mind is reflected in his personal life as well. In 1983, he married this woman, Lyudmila Shkrebnyeva, a former Aeroflight hostess. Lyudmila and Putin met when they were both students at Leningrad State University. Here's their wedding picture from 1983. Vladimir and Lyudmila had two daughters, Maria, born in Leningrad in 1985, and Yekaterina, born in Dresden in 1986. They're beautiful little girls, aren't they? Putin's wife, Lyudmila, had studied foreign languages at Leningrad State University and for several years taught German at that same university. After her husband's rise to political power, Lyudmila kept a low profile. She rarely appeared in public except for protocol or political purposes. And it's also true that their marriage was strained, to put it mildly, because of Vladimir's numerous infidelities. Lyudmila and Vladimir were divorced in 2013, but they probably would have divorced much earlier if divorce had not been frowned upon in the KGB. Their older daughter, Maria, now 36, is an endocrinologist and is married to a Dutchman. Yekaterina, the other daughter, now 35, is a professor at Moscow State University. These daughters have virtually no contact today with their father. Putin had an affair with this woman, Svetlana Krivonogic, a housekeeper at one of his luxury compounds. And she is the mother of their daughter, Luisa Rozova, seen here, born in 2003. Luisa, now 18, recently shut down her social media accounts because of the abuse that she was receiving because of her father's invasion of Ukraine. I think she looks like her father. I see the same features. Svetlana, the mother, capitalized on her liaison with Putin and has become one of the richest women in Russia today. In about 2004, while still married to Lyudmila, Putin began an affair with a Russian Olympic gymnast named Alina Kabayeva. Kabayeva had a remarkable career as an Olympic gymnast. Kabayeva is known as the most flexible person in Russia. Putin is known as the least flexible person in Russia. Alina was 21 years old when the affair started. Putin was 52, an age difference of 31 years. Here are Putin and Kabayeva together. She occasionally appears in public. Their affair has gone on for almost 20 years. And Putin and KBA have 4 children, 2 sons, and these twin daughters, age 7. KBA and the children live in well-guarded seclusion in Switzerland. The children in particular are rarely seen in public. Putin and his 2 adult daughters were placed under U.S. sanctions shortly after the invasion of Ukraine. KBA and her children were not named at first, but KBA, however, has recently been added to the U.S. and European sanctions list. Vladimir Putin has always cultivated this super macho image of himself. He's only 5 feet 7 inches tall, but he wants the world to view him as this big, tough guy. He is vain. He is narcissistic. He's a show-off. How else can you explain these other staged photos that he has released of himself? Vladimir Putin has never lost a judo contest. His opponents are told, make it look good, but be sure that he wins. He's also apparently a very skilled hockey player. In one hockey game alone, he scored 14 goals. If you know anything about hockey, you realize how truly remarkable that is. But the point is that Vladimir Putin has never known defeat of any kind until now. Because, mark my words, Vladimir Putin is headed for defeat in Ukraine. Putin is known to have had extensive cosmetic surgery, to receive regular Botox injections. He and KBA are using the same plastic surgeon. I find that very romantic. And at all costs, Putin wants to be seen by the world as young, handsome, vital, and virile. But the clock is ticking. Putin's age and health have been the topic of a great deal of international speculation. And at first glance, Putin does appear amazingly fit. For a man of almost 70, he will have his 70th birthday next month. But in a recent public appearance, his hands were visibly shaking, and he walked with a limp. And in another viral video, he seemed to be gripping a table to steady himself as he walked. No one, of course, can make a diagnosis from afar, but many Western medical experts believe that they see clear signs of Parkinson's disease. There have also been reliable reports that Putin has been under treatment by oncologists, and that he underwent surgery not too long ago for thyroid cancer, all of which, of course, the Kremlin has denied. Not to be ignored either are questions about Putin's mental health. He's definitely not the calm, cool, and calculating person that I've been watching over the years. He's become prone to these angry outbursts, to wild, irrational statements like calling the Ukrainians Nazis. And I don't know if you saw it as I did, but Putin looked absolutely unhinged when he publicly berated his intelligence chief, Naryshkin. And there have been other public appearances recently also where he has appeared out of touch. In fact, I don't think it's a stretch to say that all of Putin's actions in Ukraine can be interpreted as actions of a mentally unstable person. For example, his threat to use nuclear weapons. Now, let me be clear. I'm okay with whatever physical ailments Putin has. But for the sake of the Ukrainian people and for the sake of all of us, I hope he is not mentally ill. Because an irrational man with his finger on the trigger of nuclear weapons is our worst nightmare. And I wouldn't put anything past this man, sane or otherwise. Putin doesn't rely on military destruction alone to get his way. He uses intelligence services, the SVR and the GRU, to impose his will. One such person was Zimlikan Yandarbiev, the charismatic leader of the Chechen independence movement. Putin was convinced that Yandarbiev was behind the Moscow theater hostage. And even worse, he thought that Yandarbiev was in Qatar, rallying Muslim support for Chechen independence. On February 13th, 2004, a bomb ripped through the SUV that Yandarbiev was driving in Qatar, and he was killed. And an assassination at that level could only have taken place on Putin's orders. Here's another example. Anna Politkovskaya was a Russian journalist and human rights activist. She's one of my personal heroes. Anna was an outspoken critic of Vladimir Putin. She made a name for herself by going to Chechnya and reporting on the Russian atrocities there. She received constant threats. She knew she was living on borrowed time. In Chechnya, she was actually subjected to a mock execution. She was poisoned, from which she miraculously recovered. And back in Moscow, her friends and supporters said to her, "Anna, please leave the country now for your safety." But she refused to go because she was committed to staying in Russia to expose Putin's crimes. And she wrote this book, Putin's Russia, Life in a Failing Democracy. And this book absolutely infuriated Putin. On October 7th, 2006, Anna Politkovskaya, age 48, was assassinated in the elevator of her apartment building in Moscow, execution style, 2 bullets to the chest and 1 to the head. And no one has ever been prosecuted for her murder. And the person who without question ordered her murder will never pay the price for this crime. Here's another victim of Putin, Alexander Litvinenko. Here we see before and after photographs. Litvinenko spoke out openly about Putin's corruption, his accumulation of enormous wealth. He's possibly the richest man in the world. His shady ties to Russian oligarchs. And Litvinenko avoided execution by escaping to the United Kingdom, where he continued to work with British intelligence and continued to attack Putin. He wrote this book, Blowing Up Russia, in which he accused the FSB, the Russian intelligence service, of staging terrorist attacks to bring Putin to power. And he also accused Putin of ordering the murder of Anna Politkovskaya. So you know how this is going to turn out. On November 1st, 2006, in London, Litvinenko fell ill after a meeting with 2 visiting Russians. His conditions rapidly deteriorated, and the British police determined that he had been poisoned by polonium-210. And on his deathbed, where you saw him in the last slide, Litvinenko accused the FSB of killing him on orders from Putin, and a British inquiry concluded that the assassination could not have taken place without Putin's approval. And I would like to emphasize here something that I consider very noteworthy. Putin chose a particularly gruesome, painful, and lingering way of killing Litvinenko. Radioactive polonium poisoning is an absolutely awful way to die. So who would be in Putin's next chamber of horrors? The Skripals. Sergei Skripal was a Russian GRU military intelligence officer who was recruited as a spy by the British in 1995. He provided very valuable intelligence to the British, but was arrested by the Russians in 2004 and convicted of treason in 2006. And he would have, without any question, been executed if he had not been included in a spy swap with the British and the Americans in 2010. Skripal and his daughter Yulia settled in the UK, where Skripal resumed his work on behalf of British intelligence. Putin hated Skripal. He considered him a traitor, and he wanted him dead. And on March 4th, 2018, Skripal and his daughter Yulia were poisoned in Salisbury, England, with the nerve agent Novichok. They went into comas and nearly died, but amazingly recovered. And I'm sure Putin was furious that his assassination attempt failed. You're probably all familiar with this man, Alexei Navalny. Navalny is a Russian opposition leader and a harsh critic of Vladimir Putin. He also was poisoned with Novichok on August 20th, 2020. Navalny went into a coma and was expected to die. So the Russians, to avoid international criticism, allowed him to be transported to a hospital in Berlin. And German doctors confirmed that the substance in question was Novichok. And contrary to medical expectations, Navalny recovered and was released from hospital on September 22nd, 2020. In a press statement after his release, Navalny said the following, quote, "I assert that Putin was behind this crime. Only 3 people can give orders to use Novichok. They are the heads of the FSB, the SVR, and the GRU, and they cannot act without Putin's approval." Navalny, after he recovered, was so determined to continue his opposition to Putin that he courageously returned to Russia. a foolhardy but courageous move. And on January 17th, 2021, he was arrested at the airport in Moscow. He was sentenced to prison on trumped-up fraud charges, and I strongly doubt we'll ever see him again. There have been many other victims, which I won't describe here. But I hope I've made my point. The lesson in all this is clear. If you cross Vladimir Putin, he will come after you. If you criticize Vladimir Putin, there's a good chance you'll end up dead. So I'd like to ask that you not tell Putin about my presentation here today. I'm in enough trouble with Russia already. Since 2015, Russia has provided military support to the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad in his war against Syrian rebels. And I wanted to mention Putin's intervention in Syria because it's further proof of how vicious this man is. Putin is engaged in the same cruel and criminal tactics in Syria that we're seeing in Ukraine. And human rights groups have documented Russian bombing raids on civilians and rescue workers, on schools, hospitals, and apartment buildings. And Russian forces have made no distinction between combatants and non-combatants. They kill everyone. Amnesty International reported that, quote, in Syria, Russia is guilty of the most egregious war crimes we have seen in decades. Among other things, Putin has used cluster munitions in violation of international conventions. He's also used white phosphorus, another violation of international law. And the best estimate is that the Russians have been responsible for over 25,000 deaths in Syria, and the war goes on. So what Putin is doing in Ukraine is nothing new. We've seen it all before. That brings us to Ukraine. There's no doubt that Putin's goal is to recreate the Russian Empire. He's pursuing an imperial strategy of acquiring new territory, as we've seen successively in Chechnya, Georgia, Crimea, Syria, and Ukraine. In Ukraine, Putin's initial plan was to invade with massive force from three directions, to decapitate Kiev's government, and to install his own puppet regime, just as he had done in Belarus. And that plan depended on the rapid collapse of the Ukrainian army, the capture of Kiev, and weak leadership from President Volodymyr Zelensky. None of that happened. Putin could not have been more wrong. He miscalculated on every front. He did not expect the Ukrainian military or the entire population to rise up and to offer such fierce resistance. He didn't foresee that Zelensky would transform himself from a comic actor into an inspiring and resolute wartime leader. And he certainly did not foresee how poorly his troops would perform in Ukraine. The international media has been filled with stories on how badly the invasion has gone for Putin. His troops appear to be unprepared. They suffer from poor morale. They're confused about their mission. Many of them weren't even told that they were invading another country, let alone a sister Slavic state, the Ukraine. The Russians' logistics failed to feed their troops properly. Their fuel supplies ran out. As a result, they were unable to move on Kiev and in other battles. And we've seen in the last few days that the Ukrainian troops have actually been pushing the Russians back. That's good. They're recapturing lost territory, but let's not be too optimistic, because there's no doubt that the Russians will counterattack with massive force. Putin clearly underestimated how the rest of the world would react, how it would turn on him, how international businesses would exit Russia. He didn't expect Germany to increase its defense spending and to permanently shut down the Nord 2 gas pipeline. And he certainly didn't foresee the extent to which Western countries would send advanced weapons into Ukraine. I mean, maybe most tellingly, he did not expect Sweden and Finland, contrary to all historical precedents, to join NATO. And that's ironic, isn't it? Because one of the reasons that we believe that Putin invaded Ukraine was to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. He didn't want to see NATO strengthen. But the result has just been the opposite. By his invasion, he has revitalized NATO. He has strengthened NATO. And NATO is more united and powerful today than it has been at any time in the last 20 years. So Vladimir Putin is under enormous pressure. He's put himself in a no-win situation. And even if he defeats Ukraine militarily, which cannot be excluded, he will be faced with an unsustainable occupation against a population that despises him. It will be a guerrilla war on a scale worse than Afghanistan. And of course, there will be massive covert assistance to Ukrainian freedom fighters from the CIA and from other organizations, just as there was for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. I've often asked myself, why was Putin's intelligence so poor? Why didn't he see what would happen? My own view is that his intelligence probably wasn't poor at all. The Russian intelligence services are very capable. I believe he simply ignored the intelligence, or his intelligence chiefs decided to tell him what he wanted to hear. No matter what happened, the result has been a disaster. We believe 25,000 Russian troops have been killed in Ukraine, and 3 times that number have been wounded. The deaths include at least a dozen Russian generals. These are shocking statistics, because the war in Ukraine started in February, only 7 months ago. And to lose 25,000 dead soldiers in 7 months compares to the 10 years of the war in Afghanistan, where the Russians lost a total of 15,000. Putin is bleeding his country. Russian boys are coming home in coffins and body bags. The Russians have lost 200 planes, 1,000 tanks, 8 ships, including the flagship of the Baltic Sea Fleet, the guided missile cruiser Moskva, 1,700 small vehicles, 2,500 armored personnel carriers, and 450 artillery pieces. And these losses are certain to get worse as more and more advanced weapon systems are pouring into Ukraine from the West, including from the United States. I believe the United States was a little slow getting started, but we've made up for lost ground. The United States has sent 1,400 Stingers, anti-aircraft missiles, 155 millimeter howitzers, 183,000 artillery rounds, 200 M113 armored personnel carriers, 5,500 Javelin anti-tank missiles, 700 Switchblade drones, 7,000 small arms, and much more. And the Stingers and the Javelins, in the top row on the left is a Stinger, and the bottom on the left is a Javelin, are especially deadly against aircraft and tanks. And of course, and I'm not going to say a whole lot about this, the United States is giving Ukraine invaluable intelligence support. They know what the Russians are doing next, thanks to the intelligence support that they're getting from their friends. There's no question that Putin has had to abandon his initial plan for regime change and a complete takeover of Ukraine. Kiev has been reopened. So Putin's new objective is different. It's to consolidate his gains in the east and the south and to secure the entire Black Sea coast. And Russia's acquisition of Ukraine's entire Black Sea coast would give it control over Ukraine's grain exports. And Ukraine is the world's fourth largest exporter of corn and the fifth largest of wheat. And the Russian naval blockade has had a devastating effect on world food supplies in Africa and Asia particularly. And Zelensky has warned of a worldwide hunger crisis. And don't be fooled. Russia's decision recently to allow a few grain ships to leave was a PR stunt. It's certainly not a permanent change of their objectives. Russia's conquest of the Black Sea coast is a big issue for Putin. And to do that, he needs to take Odessa, which you can see down on the bottom in the center. And I predict that Odessa will be one of Putin's next targets, and he's already begun the onslaught with missiles fired from his offshore naval ships and by attacks from other sources, all continuing as we speak. And what will be Odessa's fate when that time comes? We can see it clearly by what happened in Mariupol, another Black Sea port. The people of Mariupol suffered miserably. And the fact that Mariupol is a Russian-speaking country, there's always been a Russian-speaking city, almost always historically oriented toward Moscow, was irrelevant to Putin. As a Black Sea port, it had to be captured. And to capture it, it had to be destroyed. And destroyed it was. Russian missiles and artillery were fired into civilian areas and forced the evacuation of the population. When this was going on, my wife Meredith and I prayed every day for the heroic defenders of the steel plant in Mariupol. As you remember, their situation was desperate. They pledged to fight to the death. And many of them did die, and the rest were imprisoned when the Russians finally captured the plant. The images coming out of Ukraine are heartbreaking. Almost 5.6 million refugees. Another 7.7 million have been displaced within the country. And not well known, but the fact is that 90% of the Ukrainian refugees are women and children. And in most cases, the men are leaving their families behind to fight. I can't even imagine those heartbreaking scenes of Ukrainian women and children saying goodbye to their husbands and fathers with the likelihood that they might never see each other again. Poland has received more refugees than all the other European countries combined, more than 3 million. And thank goodness for the Poles, because the Polish people have opened up their borders. They've opened up their hearts. They've opened up their resources. I can't even begin to imagine what the fate of the Ukrainian refugees would have been without the wonderful people of Poland. President Biden has announced that the U.S. will accept up to 100,000 Ukrainian refugees. And I expect that number, and I hope that number will go up. What's next? Putin's thirst for power will not let him stop. I would bet anything that the next country he invades will be Moldova. The young president of Moldova, Maya Sandu, has anticipated the threat. She knows that she does not have the capability to resist a military invasion. She's applied for European Union membership. But that won't stop Putin. This decision to join the European Union was not welcomed by the government of Transnistria, a separatist region in eastern Moldova, a region backed by the Russians. And Russia has an unknown number of troops in Transnistria that can be seen as very valuable, perhaps, in the attack on Odessa. And you can see the proximity there in the map on the right between Moldova and the port of Odessa. With Moldova, Russia will have surrounded much of Ukraine with vassal states. It's already taken Belarus to the north, where President Lukashenko is a Russian puppet. And if Putin succeeds in holding southern and eastern Ukraine, sealing off the Black Sea coast, and overrunning Moldova, 77% of Ukraine's border will be controlled by Russia, and Ukraine will be economically strangled. I have some unsolicited advice for President Zelensky. The Russians will never leave the Black Sea coast unless the Ukrainian military drives them out. Economic sanctions will not deter Putin, nor will threats of war crime trials. Only the Ukrainian army can do it. And that's why it's so essential, ladies and gentlemen, that the United States and NATO must continue to provide naval and air armaments to the Ukrainians to stop the Russian advances in the east and the south and to break the blockade along the Black Sea. Here's another scenario. And right here and now, today, I'm making a prediction. Vladimir Putin will not survive Ukraine. There is a strong undercurrent of secret opposition to Putin. There are Russians in all walks of life who detest him. Many Russians are appalled and ashamed at what he's doing in Ukraine. There have already been attempts on his life. Putin is destroying Russia. The Russian people are suffering terribly from economic sanctions. Russia has been sealed off from the world. Russia has become an international pariah. So my prediction is that some combination of the Russian military, the intelligence services, and the oligarchs will decide enough is enough and will take him out. Tyrants tend to die violent deaths. And Putin is no exception. Our great fear, of course, and yours as well, is that there's this terrible prospect that Putin, in his desperation to avoid defeat, will go on a rampage, destroying Ukrainian cities, murdering the civilian population on a larger scale than he's already done. And I don't even rule out a tactical nuclear weapon. Dictators like Putin are most dangerous when they're wounded, when they're about to be defeated. A variation on this theme is that Putin will take his own life. He's not psychologically capable of accepting defeat and humiliation. And defeat and humiliation are exactly what he's facing in Ukraine. Likewise, Putin will never submit to a war crimes trial. And so it is certainly feasible that he may decide that his only way out is to kill himself. I saw a cartoon not too long ago of a Ukrainian man in the ruins of a Ukrainian city holding up a sign. And that sign said, "Putin, fast forward to the part where you kill yourself in a bunker." An obvious allusion to Adolf Hitler's suicide in a bunker in Berlin in 1945. And that is not a far-fetched scenario. So I don't know if Putin's demise will be by assassination or by suicide, but I'm convinced that one or the other will happen. So when I look at Vladimir Putin, what do I see? I see a dead man walking. On that happy note, let's open the floor to any questions or comments you have. There might be a floor mic, I'm not sure, but you can certainly shout out the questions. I'll do my best to hear them and to repeat them. Yes, sir.
In your likely event that Putin won't be with us much longer, will the generals give up the territories or will they continue the fight? And is Russia's being controlled by the oligarchs and dictators for longer probably than they've been in existence? Yeah. What is the hope for democracy for Russia?
I have high hopes. I may be overly optimistic, but I believe that the people who do the right thing and eliminate this man will be doing it for the right reasons. I believe that they will probably be democratically inclined. They will try to reverse the trend. I believe they will give back the territory. They will try to re-enter the community of nations. I believe they'll actually help rebuild Ukraine from the damage that they caused. I would be tragically saddened if Putin were simply replaced by another dictator, someone who continued the war. But I think the motivation of the people who will do this will be purer than that. And I believe that we will see a new Russia after this is all over. Other questions? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes. Yes. Yeah, it's an excellent question. The question is about Putin's control of energy for Western Europe. Will he use that to force some kind of an accommodation, some kind of an agreement? I don't think so. I think the Europeans have already accepted the reality of a dark winter, as you put it. And I don't think that there's any motivation on the part of the West Europeans, particularly the Germans, who had the lead role in that, in giving in to Putin's threats. That would be a huge mistake. There's enough oil that can be directed to Europe, I think, to stave off a real disaster. So, no, I don't think that he's got that leverage anymore. I think he's, with the Nord 2 pipeline, he basically lost the pressure that he could have applied. Other questions? Yes, sir. Yeah. Could the invasion of Ukraine by Russia have been prevented if we'd been stronger? You can't speculate on that, but I can tell you one thing. I think our departure from Afghanistan on the world stage was one of the worst things that could have happened to us, because it showed the United States to be weak, indecisive, a paper tiger. And I think that encouraged dictators. I don't think it's a coincidence that Putin waited a long time. He massed his troops on the border, and he didn't really move until after Afghanistan. And my great fear is that the Chinese also will be encouraged by that. That was not our finest hour. Afghanistan was shameful, ladies and gentlemen, in my opinion. We had the intelligence. We had the time. We had the capability for an honorable withdrawal, to take our equipment with us, and above all, to rescue those courageous Afghanistans who put their lives in our hands. We didn't do any of that. We were operating under a false timetable, and I think what we did there was one of the lowest points in U.S. foreign policy. And it had implications I think we haven't even completely felt yet. So if we had been stronger, if we'd been firmer, if we had united NATO earlier to stand up to Putin's massing of troops along the border of Ukraine, who knows? I think it's possible we could have deterred him from doing that. But that's highly speculative. Any other questions? Yes, sir. What do I think of the likelihood of China's moving across the Straits of Taiwan? It's inevitable. At a time of their choosing, they will move. The Chinese play the long game. They want Taiwan back. They will get Taiwan back. They will invade with overwhelming force. And I believe their calculation is that the United States and the rest of the West will sit idly by, will protest, but will not respond militarily. I'm saddened as a proud American that I don't believe that we would have the military capability to engage China in the Far East with the resource we have available now. It's a sad fact. I tell you one thing, that people in my profession consider China the #1 long-term national security threat to the United States. What they're doing already in the United States is outrageous. They're conducting espionage on an unprecedented scale. They're stealing our technology. They're getting into our financial sector. They're getting into our electrical grid. If I could start my career all over again, I would love to. I'd try to get into the CIA's China program. I would learn Mandarin. I'd become a China counterintelligence specialist, because that is the future. That's what I tell my students in my intelligence classes at the Bush School. Your career is going to be directed by 3 things. You need to develop expertise in these 3 things. The first is China, because they're not going away. The second is cyber, because cyber is the future of warfare. And the third thing is money, financial intelligence. And that's a rapidly growing area. We're recruiting a lot of finance majors, accountants, bankers to join us because we know that whether it's terrorists or foreign intelligence services or narcotics traffickers or organized crime, if you can get into their money flows, you can bring them down. And so that's why we are rapidly expanding into that area. If you know any young finance majors or accountants who would like to serve their country in financial intelligence, we're open for business. They can go to East Kentucky and study banking, or they can apply directly to the CIA, but there's a future for them. Any other questions? Okay. Yes. Yeah. Well, I think, as I said, Putin was essentially handpicked by Yeltsin. And Yeltsin was no Democrat. You know, he probably alleviated the risks of a violent transfer of power in Russia. But Yeltsin was a very ruthless man himself. I think he and Putin were soulmates. I think they saw the world in the same terms. Gorbachev was different. Gorbachev, I believe, was a true statesman, an honorable man. And I give our namesake at the Bush School, President George Herbert Walker Bush and Gorbachev, tremendous credit for overseeing the transition of the Soviet Union into the Russian state as peacefully as it was. If Yeltsin had been in power, and what I really shudder at, the thought if Putin had been in power at that time, because I can guarantee it would not have gone as peacefully and smoothly as it did. Yes, maybe one more? Well, let me close then by thanking you again for inviting me to be back. It's so nice to be with you again. And I realize that our topic today has not been a cheery one. But the world is learning a valuable lesson, one that I think all of us should be aware of. And that is that war criminals like Putin must be stopped. And with the kind of strong and unified support and response that we're seeing from the Western democracies, led by the United States, Putin will and can be stopped. So let me just conclude by saying, God bless the Kentucky Bankers Association, all of you and your families. God bless all of our men and women in uniform, our police, our firefighters, and our first responders. God bless all of our men and women under cover. God bless the people of Ukraine. And God bless the United States of America. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, James. That was horrifying. Okay, let's go get some lunch. Tonight, we're going to celebrate the accomplishments of the past year with our closing banquet. The pre-banquet reception will be right outside here of the Banyan Ballroom at 5:15, followed by the banquet at 6 o'clock in this room. Following dinner, you won't want to miss the American Spirit with former Congressman Jason Chaffetz, which will close out this year's convention. There's no further business, so this session is adjourned. Thank you. Have a great rest of your